My turn to host again. You can't get away from me. But I'm joined today by Marco and Richard and by Matthew. Thanks for joining me, guys. So we're having a look at the news again today, obviously surrounding Israel. Our main topic is going to be, since Tuesday is always the kind of British-focused episode of the reality show, we'll be looking at the Remembrance Day protests. Since for some of our viewers, I think, won't know too much about the particularities of the protests around the cenotaph, we're going to talk a little bit about what those are, what the history of protests surrounding the cenotaph is, and what the significance of that is, and what they're trying to achieve. And various people have called for this protest to be cancelled. Some have supported it for some bad reasons and some for perhaps principled reasons. So we'll discuss that a little bit. If we get time, we're going to talk about a leading figure in Hamas who, when interviewed by the BBC, denied that any civilians or women and children were killed by Hamas when they invaded into Israel recently, extraordinarily. And we're going to talk about how he thinks he can make that claim and how people can support Palestine when people are saying things like this, which are blatant lies. And then, if we have some time, there's been discussion in the news of a suppressed report that was done over 20 years ago into anti-Israel bias in the BBC. This report was deliberately suppressed by the BBC, and only some top figures have read it. We're going to talk a little bit about that and what that says about the BBC and so on and so forth. But to jump into the main topic, so Remembrance Day, I think everyone is going to know what Remembrance Day is. Obviously, that's the day of remembrance that happens on the 11th of November to remember the soldiers in the First World War, but also soldiers who have died in combat generally. And I think in America, they celebrate a similar thing on the same day. But perhaps our viewers in America around the world won't know what the cenotaph is. So Marco and Richard, tell us about the cenotaph, its significance as a target for protest, and why this is going on.
Okay, well, the cenotaph itself, it's an empty tomb, a monument in Whitehall, just right near Downing Street, not far from Downing Street, and it's the place where the ceremony is held every Remembrance Day or every Sunday close to Remembrance Day, where the Prime Minister, the royalty, each of the party leaders lay wreaths and poppies against the monument that. To mark the dead in, as Morgan said, in all wars, and they're to mark the service to the country. Essentially, Armistice Day, Remembrance Day, Veterans Day, all the same thing by different names. As a point of protest, it's for a long time it was considered something that you didn't mess with at all, and it was sort of the one monument that even the most anarchic lefty would tend not to go near and deface or attempt to attack in any way. But that is, in recent years, that has begun to change as all sorts of things have happened with the in society generally, particularly following things like BLM protests during COVID, or the statue outside Parliament of Winston Churchill, for example, which is a regular statue that needs to be boarded up in order to protect it from paint, and people throwing things at it or attaching flags to it during protests of all sorts of a nature. And of course, added to that, the environmentalists who have no barriers as to what they'll attack or deface in the interests of their supposed cause.
Yeah, and this is coming actually, although it's not motivated by the same cause. We saw, I think, just yesterday, Just Stop Oil. I think we're in the National Gallery again, and then we're hammering on a painting, smashing the glass. So I think a number of the protests we're seeing are really kind of nihilistic. But Matthew, we've seen a couple of groups criticize. So the Metropolitan Police is the group, in effect, you have to get permission from to hold a protest in London. They need to consent to it. And some people have come out in strong criticism of this planned protest on Remembrance Day. So typically kind of militaristic or nationalistic kind of figures. So you've got military veterans, for obvious reasons, are very critical of this. Nigel Farage, previous leader of UKIP, now a TV pundit, has been critical of the Met for allowing this, and they want it cancelled. The sainted Owen Jones has been very critical of the Met for asking people not to do the protests. So the Met's actually asked for this not to go ahead. He's claimed that all these protests have been non-violent, whereas actually, and we've seen some actual violence at these protests in recent days, so maybe we'll talk about that a bit. And Amnesty International as well has asked that it be allowed on a kind of principled basis. So Matthew, I mean, what do you make of the people who are calling on the Met to support it or to cancel it. Do you think that it should be allowed to go ahead? Do you think there's a free speech issue, or do you think it should be stopped? Oh, you're just on mute, Matthew.
Sorry, guys. That's better. Well, I think there are a number of issues arising. Firstly, perhaps being the resident lawyer, let me explain the sort of legal position. So Suella Braverman, our Home Secretary, seems to be making various statements to the effect that she's not entirely comfortable with the idea of the protest going ahead. And she put another statement out. I think it was her sort of reminding the Metropolitan Police to consider all of their powers in terms of dealing with protests. The position legally, she can't do it on her own steam, but were there to be a request from the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Suella Braverman, as the Home Secretary, does have the power to actually stop the march from going ahead. I say stop it going ahead. She has the power to legally prohibit the march. The sort of criticism of that idea is that you may end up potentially with an even more disorderly situation where the protesters try to go ahead with the march in contravention of that prohibition order, potentially causing more trouble in terms of the police response to it. I think, as far as what the organisers of the protests have said, to be completely fair to them, they have agreed not to start the march until after the sort of key time, 11 o'clock, when we have the traditionally have the kind of 2-minute silence, and everybody just spends a couple of minutes actually thinking about the soldiers. And they actually have said that they will route the march well clear of Whitehall, where the cenotaph is. So they do seem to kind of be alive to the issue and the reasons people are maybe not comfortable with this happening, particularly on Saturday, on Remembrance Day. The other side of that is that there has, although it's been limited, there has been disorder to some extent in the previous marches. There have been problems. There have been situations where people have been assaulted, where the slogans being used have perhaps crossed the line, where the police have eventually had to intercede for one reason or another, and where, excuse me, bear in mind we are talking about basically a couple of dozen of people being arrested in a march that's had thousands and thousands of people in it. So it is a small minority that's actually been causing the trouble, certainly so far. But at the end of the day, I think it has to be said, it's a special day once a year when we are commemorating people who've died in war, and it's perhaps not the best date for a march like this to have been organised, would be my view.
Yeah, I think, although I think essentially what we can see is an attempt to be strategic, because they're going to do it after the 2-minute silence, and that, I guess, is an attempt to make them seem like they're not treading on the kind of sacred ground of Remembrance Day. And yet the whole reason to have it on Remembrance Day is because and I think a goal of a lot of the protests we've seen in recent years is to upset things that people hold as valuable, hold as sacred. Why did the Just Stop Oil people go in and smash paintings or throw paint on them and so on? Because they think people are holding these as higher values than, global warming or the sacrosanct nature of the earth or something. And why are people protesting on Remembrance Day? Because people are paying more attention to remembering soldiers than to the plight of Palestinians. And that's, I think that's why they're doing that. But Marco, there's an issue at hand is kind of, there's a free speech issue potentially that's being raised. I'm interested in what you think about that. But then also connected to that, there's an issue of the right to protest. And I hear some mixed things coming from objectivists about this. Some people are very critical. What, do you have a right to protest at all? And some people argue that you have a right to protest as an extension of a right to speak freely. Do you think there's a right to protest? Do you think there's a free speech issue here? What do you make of it?
Well, of course, people are free to say what they want and do what they want within the constraint of the law and other people's freedoms. However, given that we live in a less than perfect society, mixed economy and all that, you can't possibly stop at this point people from marching. I'm not in favor of the kind of marches which include trampling all over public property and all this kind of stuff, public property, and all this kind of causing as much hassle as possible to other people. However, I would support their right to protest. I do not approve of it because I think it's totally inappropriate. And I certainly do not condone any form of violence or incitement to violence that might occur during these things. And I think they should feel the full force of the law where they to call for jihad or this kind of violent behavior. Of course, the protest itself has been planned fairly far away from Whitehall, where the cenotaph is. So hopefully there's not going to be any idiots who strays from it and goes and cause wanton destruction. But the closest point would be about 3/4 of a mile, perhaps. They're going to go down Victoria and towards the new American embassy, which is on the other side of the river in Battersea. By the way, is surrounded by a moat, so good luck to them. Why are they going towards the US embassy? Beyond me. But now, the other issue is that of course, 11 o'clock, it's 11 o'clock because the armistice came into, for the end of the First War, came into being at 11 o'clock, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. So to them, it's not particularly difficult to postpone the time for the start, because usually protests start at 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock anyway, because if you ever use London transport, to organize a group of people before 12 o'clock is kind of an effort in the first place. So again, it's a concession that they give us very kindly, because really it doesn't cost them anything. I don't think it's out of respect to the people celebrating and remembering the servicemen and the veterans. So
I think I would add to that. I mean, Rishi Sunak, our Prime Minister, has described it as provocative and disrespectful. I think those are two fairly appropriate adjectives. There's quite a similarity in terms of principle here between people protesting during the Queen's funeral, for example, when the cortege was going past, the Republicans, for example, and you can argue the same arguments in relation to the disrespect for that. And therefore having a separate protest somewhere slightly apart from the route that the cortege passes to express your views against having a monarchy or whatever it seems like the sensible compromise, or sensible, not disrespecting the fact that someone's died, etc., even if you hold a different view. And the same here, I think there's certain similarities. I mean, as Matthew said, when it comes to banning marches, well, the BLM march during lockdown was legally prohibited, wasn't it? So, but that obviously doesn't stop a lot of people turning out and doing it anyway. And because the UK is a country where the police by consent. They police by trying to appeal constantly to the rational element in whoever they're talking to, whether that's a raging drunk on a Saturday night or whether that's a bunch of rioters. They're trying to appeal to the idea that, oh, come on, it's raining, you should go home, or whatever technique they can do to persuade them to clear the road or move back, or and so all of that kind of stuff is doesn't really work when the other side, that those protesting are truly aiming to cause disruption or to be really aggressive. And you're seeing lots of footage at the moment of people really yelling firmly in the face of police officers wearing hijabs or face coverings or whatever, in an attempt to provoke a reaction from the police, and they're right up in their face, and the police are just having to stand there and take it at the moment, and that in itself is quite a difficult thing to watch, because you're seeing an unfair situation right before your eyes.
Yeah. There's an aspect of what you said, Marco, which I think is important to bring out, because I guess I didn't cover it. The march itself isn't actually planned on going to the cenotaph, as I understand it, and this was part of our criticism of the criticism of the march, was that it's not planned to go near the cenotaph. So when people are concerned about the cenotaph, it's been a target of protest in the past, and there's an obvious worry that, given that this is on Remembrance Day and so on and so forth, that it's going to go near the cenotaph. And I'm playing devil's advocate slightly here, but Remembrance Day is, it's an important day to me, but there's a strong element almost of a kind of social pressure around it. Kind of, there's been a lot of criticism in recent years, for example, if you don't wear a poppy, which is a sign of marking the day, that people kind of don't want to wear the poppy because they feel like a kind of social conforming kind of pressure that you're a bad person if you just haven't gone out and spent £1 on this poppy. Whereas, which is there's something to that, because actually what's important about Remembrance Day is remembrance. Like, if you value soldiers, if you value the sacrifice that they've made, that is that's the kind of important thing, not whether you bought a little poppy on your chest. And so for example, an example of this, some flags were taken down off the cenotaphs in recent days, and people's instant response was to kind of go to that the government is doing this because they don't want to inflame the protesters. And the government has said that actually this happens every year. The flags are being cleaned before they're going to be put back up for Remembrance Day so that they look nice. And do you think there's an element of, people obviously feel strongly about Remembrance Day? Do you think people are being a bit reactionary about this? Like, as much as I disapprove of the march taking place on Remembrance Day, I think that's being done on purpose. Do you think people that have kind of a nationalistic kind of feeling are overreacting about this?
To be honest,
I think
in the past we felt exactly like that. We kind of we have a poppy, but I don't actually wear it outside where it can be seen. I just have it on me, but not showing it off. To me, I hate this kind of fake show or support of veterans and military members, because it feels like for one day, for 1 week, or whatever the period, how long the period is, people seem to pretend to support them. Most of the rest of the year, they actually are treated like dirt. The fact that the UK is not treating the veterans anywhere as good as well as the United States does is just personally, I find it shameful. So I would like to see support for veterans and military members around the clock, all year round. I don't like this kind of spurious temporary shows of support. Now, the fact that lots of people are wearing poppy, sometimes it's sort of tribalism. They show I'm in your team, and now more than ever is actually used to show that I'm not with that lot that screams and shouts pro Hamas and stuff like that. So in a way, the whole feeling has been hijacked by, as you said, a sort of nationalism, a sort of sense of I'm real Britons, you're not, and that can only throw petrol on the flames. Really, I don't see anything good coming of this separation. That's why it would be nice if we wore a poppy figurative all year round rather than coming out once a month.
I think one of the things you've seen is that over the last few years that Remembrance Day has become a totemic sort of a last bastion stand of old traditional values. Some of those tradition for tradition's sake, some of those Western values that we should be defending, such as, you know, fighting for freedom and those kind of things. And because our defense of such important things has essentially shrunk to a single day, and now that day itself is under threat, that's what makes people extra angry and extra inflamed about it. But of course, the damage is really done long before anybody does anything provocative on that day. It's in the gradual erosion of the things that we should be supporting, as Marcus says, in the case of veterans, but more broadly, you know, every day of the year, and shouting loudly and not being ashamed of who we are and what we stand for as a country and as a society.
And also, the reason why these guys can go around and behave like total idiots and thugs is because people before us laid their life in order to give us this kind of freedom. And now it's not only abused, but we are kind of forgetting that their lives contributed to what we're living now.
Yeah. Matthew, I'm going to come to you with this. And just maybe as a bit of context from my view on it. When I was growing up, I think I felt very cynical about Remembrance Day. It was the school I went to had a war memorial for students who were killed in the First World War, and you were kind of taken out of class and you would go there and people would read poems and so on and so forth. That it was this kind of group sentimental kind of experience. And the type of teenager I was, I felt very cynical about that. I kind of thought, oh, this is I don't love saying this now, but I kind of felt like this is how the system kind of enforces itself on you or something like that. And as I've grown older, I feel less like that, but there still is a notable element of conformity to it. And, you know, I think there is an element of people maybe overreacting. And Matthew, do you see it that way? Because there's a strong sense in which obviously they planned it on Remembrance Day for a reason. But do you think people are hitting out a bit, overreacted a little bit? So we see Matthew Ridley was, you know, the issue about the flags. He kind of tweeted, as the great-grandson of someone who designed the cenotaph, I feel kind of offended by this. And as much as I have respect for Matthew Ridley, what does it matter that your great-grandfather designed the cenotaph? That's a bit emotional and weird. So are people overreacting, Matthew, or do you think it's justified?
Well, I think on the general issue, I mean, I don't know if you can see it. I've actually got one of the little lapel pin poppies on me at the moment, which I've always worn one at this time of year for very many years since childhood, really. I have no issue at all with anyone taking the view that they don't want to wear one for whatever reason. In terms of sort of social pressure to wear one, I don't see it. I mean, I've been out around London today. I had to go to a court in a different part of town. I was very much in the minority from what I saw in actually wearing a poppy. Most people I came across weren't wearing them. Oh, excuse me. In terms of people perhaps taking umbrage, so to speak, I guess there may be an element of that in terms of the sort of usual suspects, sort of people like Nigel Farage and the far right and whatever, just trying to oppose the left for the sake of it. At the same time, I can understand that many people do genuinely see it as a sort of solemn occasion that is for remembering those who died at war, and that they do see it, rightly or wrongly, as offensive to be holding this protest march on the same day. So I mean, I can see the two sides of it there, I think.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of, I guess, a nuanced perspective in the sense that I think the choice to have the protest on Remembrance Day really does betray the nihilism of it, in the sense that Remembrance Day is a day of tremendous importance to a lot of people, and there's a real value there. It's not people being sentimental for no reason, and their choice to hold it on Remembrance Day in favor of a group which is killing Israeli soldiers, a group who are defending civilization in the Middle East. There's something really kind of spitting in the face of the occasion. I think about doing that, but then at the same time, I think because there's such strong emotions attached to Remembrance Day, I think people are letting their emotions get in the way of their judgment to some extent. I think there's reasonable to be concerned about the cenotaph, but Remembrance Day stirs up such feelings for a lot of people. It's a day when very moving poetry is read, and even though it's soldiers from throughout history who are remembered, particularly soldiers of the First World War, and there's a lot of kind of almost civilizational emotion tied into that conflict. So yeah, I think people are overreacting to some extent, but people at the same time, there's something really wrong about the protest going on Remembrance Day.
But I think, sorry, to add a couple of things. I think the argument that they've used is the fact they've been doing this every Saturday, and it's just a coincidence that it happens. This Saturday happens to fall on the 11th. Now you can obviously, buy that or not, but also you've seen lately the intimidation of people selling poppies for the British Legion, and even there's been a particular photograph that's been quite shown around on social media and in newspapers and stuff, which is one of those protests at railway stations where there's a group of poppy sellers, two old ladies and an old gent, selling their poppies from a stand, as they would do every year in the middle of the station, looking utterly bewildered and somewhat intimidated as they're completely surrounded by pro-Palestinian supporters with flags who have taken over the station and leave them as an oasis in the middle of it. And that does represent the clash of cultures going on at the moment, and that does speak to far more than the two groups being represented in the picture. And it's nobody who lives in Britain doesn't understand that. It's an instant, no matter what your age is, no matter what your experience of either poppy selling or the Middle East. You understand that this is a clash, and I think my concern would be not necessarily the cenotaph as such, but clashes that may well take place across the country, because there are war memorials in every town and every village all over the place, and it only takes a bunch of idiots here, there, or somewhere else to deface or cause a ruckus of some kind. And that's more likely what you're going to see, much as I don't want to suggest or predict such an event.
And these protests, these marches, are not actually a spontaneous thing. They're organized, and the largest organizer is the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which is a company. And among the patrons, there is, of course, Jeremy Corbyn, a current member of parliament. There are former Labour members of parliament. There are major people from the Labour unions. Ken Loach, the director, is one of them. There are some actors and playwrights. So this thing it's not like it happened to be on a Saturday. It's very well organized. These guys are mostly British people who know exactly what they represent. They know exactly how to antagonize the rest of Britain, and they don't care. They just, as you said, total nihilists. They just go for it and stick a finger up to people and dead people's memories as well.
It's no surprise in the protests you've seen, as you see in every protest, socialist worker posters. They have the posters of socialist work on the top, and then whatever the issue of the day is at the bottom, which at the moment happens to be obviously the pro-Palestine group or the anti-Israel group, depending on your point of view. And one thing that's been notable is the absolute absence of the left. Where is our mayor? He's hiding under the table. He's completely absent from this discussion, given that he's in charge of the Metropolitan Police. And of course, the Labour Party itself, which has described this as an operational police matter and done everything they can not to stake a position one way or the other, since many of the people on the marches are also the kind that vote for them.
As Matthew was saying, in order for the Home Secretary to intervene, she needs the say-so of the Chief of Police. But the Chief of Police, of course, works for the Mayor. If the Mayor says, pipe down, he's not going to ask for it. And therefore, she's not going to be able to do anything. They know how the system works.
On very quickly, on the issue you mentioned of protesters actually sitting down and sort of blocking up the railway stations. That, on the face of it, is actually illegal anyway, because they're, strictly speaking, not supposed to be protesting in a way that disrupts what is classed as public infrastructure, which includes railway stations. And the British Transport Police have actually been receiving a bit of flack for not actually stepping in more and kind of breaking up that situation where everyone was sitting down in the railway station.
Yeah. And just before we move on, I think I mentioned this on the Daily Objective side. I don't think I mentioned on this one, but related to what you said, Richard, in Edinburgh, there's a tradition, which I think happens across a lot of the country, that on the main shopping street, which is Printers Street in Edinburgh, veterans go out and collect money to sell poppies every year. And one of them had been doing this so long that he actually received a knighthood. He was doing this well into his 90s. I think he's unfortunately passed away, but the kind of new generation of still very old veterans who are coming in to do this. One of them was actually punched at a pro-Palestine protest just the other day. This is an old man who's there in his uniform, and was assaulted by these people. So at the same time, there's something really disgusting going on there. We're going to move to the next topic, but I think we've got a couple of super chat. So we've got 9 from Jonathan. Jonathan's always a great supporter of us. And 99 cents from Ashley Shrug. So thank you very much. So guys, our second topic are comments made by a leading member of Hamas, whose name is Musa Abu Marzouk. He commented in an interview to the BBC that Hamas had not killed any civilians, women or children recently in their incursion on the 7th of October. And that in fact, if Hamas were going to release hostages, which he was implying that they wanted to do, Israel would need to stop the fighting first. And this is particularly in reference to some hostages who had dual Russian citizenship, because they're getting some kind of tacit support from Russia, but at the same time, Russia's putting pressure for getting these people out. This obviously is almost completely absurd. Nobody, I think, is under the illusion for a single second that Hamas is not killing civilians. Everyone kind of knows that's what they're here to do. So what's your impression of this? What's going on here? Why did he think he could say this and get away with it? And why do people then support this group tacitly, openly or tacitly? Marco and Richard, what do you guys think?
Well, I mean, he does it because he knows that we have a weakness in our system, the tolerance of idiots like the echelons at the BBC who allow this thing to happen. They are turning our system against us because they know perfectly well that we haven't got the balls to stand up for our own values. So that is doing exactly what people like Xi Jinping and Putin do. They notice our weaknesses and they exploit it against us.
And I think, although I hate the term post-truth, I think it does sum up kind of the period we're in, where people can say different things that totally contradict each other or blatantly contradict reality, and the different sections of society will hear only the bit they want to hear, repeat only the bit they want to repeat. So you will see people on Twitter, for example, claiming just that there were no such civilians killed or whatever, even if it's patently true that there were, and there's plenty of evidence, and they'll just say, where's your evidence? And then that's, but they're not interested in evidence. They've already accepted their version of the narrative. So I think it's this ability to gaslight people and to for people to choose their little silo and ignore some of the wider truth.
I mean, to do this on the month anniversary of the attack by Hamas on Israel is just beyond reproachable.
Matthew, so this was done in an interview with the BBC, who we're probably going to talk about a little bit more as it's going on. And the BBC has kind of tried to walk a wobbly line to acknowledge them as terrorists. They want to grill Israel for what they're doing, whilst at the same time kind of normally voicing displeasure with Hamas. And in this interview, they tried to, you know, criticize him for saying this, but they weren't really successful. Why? One, what do you make of this? But also, why is the BBC so weak in the face of obviously evil person spouting lies?
Well, clearly the Hamas spokesman is just talking complete nonsense. I mean, the evidence is out there for everyone to see, and as far as I understand it, at least some of it actually Hamas themselves were putting out on their own social media channels on the day, actually basically broadcasting exactly what was going on. I think the issue with the BBC is that they have this whole notion of being impartial in terms of any contentious sort of political or contentious kind of news issues, and sometimes they seem to end up acting in quite a sort of warped way as a result of that, and that they are actually failing to hold these people to account because they seem to not want to be perceived as taking a biased position.
Yeah, for people who I guess who don't live in the UK, part of the BBC's kind of the rules which govern the BBC as the state broadcaster is that they're not allowed to take a position on political matters. So there's this phrase of BBC impartiality, that they need to walk the line and be impartial about things. And yet, of course, as in any reporting of the news, impartiality in the sense of not in any way having value judgment or any kind of interpretation of the facts isn't really that easy to do, and certainly it's not what the BBC actually does. Even if that were to be possible for them to do, they don't really ever manage it. What you see is a kind of selectivity about what they condemn and what they don't, and so on and so forth. Who they might condemn in some sense terrorists and who they might not. And I'm sort of flabbergasted by this. I mean, it's interesting. I sometimes realize I'm perhaps more naive than I sometimes think I am, and that I would have expected the BBC to kind of be much more critical about this than they were. And I appreciate the journalist on the hand probably, you know, he nominally was trying to say to this guy, obviously, Hamas have killed lots of civilians. And yet some of their journalists are really tough on the Israeli ambassadors and people like that, and they just have to take it. Whereas they kind of had to apologetically say about this guy that, oh, he had this cool, calm, collected demeanor throughout the interview, and then he showed irritation when we tried to press on him. And the tone of it was kind of like they couldn't actually, almost like he was intimidating them out of doing more in opposing them, which I thought was just extraordinary. But yeah, so
I mean, this seems to be like a parody that I've seen, I think, on Twitter or something, of an Israeli group making a parody of the BBC. That's the BBC living their own parody, really, because you're telling me that in the case, I mean, would they have hosted the Nazi Party and give them space, and in order to balance, not take a position on them? They know perfectly well that Hamas is under the rules of the government which actually funds them, is declared a terrorist organization. And for them to come out and say, oh, we have to be impartial, it's total poppycock.
one of the things you often see with the BBC is it's only when ex-presenters say that what is patently obvious to the rest of us anyway. And one ex-presenter of the BBC said recently that the reason that the BBC don't call Hamas a terrorist organization is because they're afraid of losing their access to Gaza and their ability to report from the scene in Gaza, because Hamas would no longer let them if they use that term back in the UK. And that's the kind of impartiality that leads to the appalling moral choices that you make in order to cling to what you claim is impartiality. And that's why they continue to refer to the numbers quoted in Gaza for deaths as being from the health ministry, as if it's an equivalent body to even our hideous NHS.
Yeah, they keep sorry, Morgan. They keep referring to Hamas on the BBC News as regarded by the British government as being a terrorist group. I mean, it's just call them what they are, for heaven's sake.
And at what point do the events of October the 7th not allow you to make a judgment that says that? And it's just ridiculous. But of course, when it comes, as we mentioned in the past, when it comes to like the hospital explosion, they're very quick to report on it from the Hamas perspective and to take that full line without any qualification.
Yes. So this leads, I think, quite neatly actually into our third topic, which I actually had never heard of this before. I don't know if you guys had, but 20 years ago, the BBC, one of their senior journalists, Michael Balin, to do a internal investigation, report into anti-Israel sentiment within the BBC, or an anti-Israeli bias. Now, they spent a lot of money on this, and they compiled the report, and they never published it. And in fact, they spent £350,000 of taxpayers' money in suppressing the report, deliberately not releasing it. I think even in the face of freedom of information requests and things like that. So, I mean, I'm shocked by this. I'd never heard of this before. This hadn't been more controversial. Had you guys heard of this report?
No.
First time I hear of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, really. And so nobody knows what's in the report except for a few senior figures at the BBC, it turns out. And the obvious result, I think, does this qualify as the Streisand effect? By suppressing it, they kind of inflame the issue of seeming whether there's anti-Semitism or anti-Israeli sentiment at the BBC. Because obviously, by suppressing it, you wonder, well, what are they trying to hide? They asked for this report themselves. Why wouldn't they want to publish it? Is there something in it that they don't want people to know? And this links into what you were saying, Rich, because obviously one of the things that people have noticed is that the BBC has a tendency in this conflict to take the Palestinian side of things, so to speak, as objective fact, not worthy of questioning more. And they suddenly have a very high epistemic standard when considering something from the Israeli point of view. Razi pointed out, for example, some BBC presenters who, when Rachel Riley referred to a particular video of Hamas militants killing people, suddenly the presenters were like, oh, well, we haven't verified this video and so on, so we can't guarantee that. Whereas then when it comes to the hospital explosion a few days ago, or maybe even weeks ago now, they were very quick to assume that was simply true, and that there was nothing contentious here. What's your perspective on this report? How should it be published? What's your view? Do you view the BBC as being really biased to this? Do you think there's probably struggles in the organization about this, or do you think there's even a lot of perhaps even institutional anti-Semitism in the BBC?
For me, it's the phrase 20 years ago that leaps out of this, and that even if you saw that report today, however appalling and however much it would make us all explode, it would still not cover what's going on now by some considerable margin, because the deterioration in standards, values, and real impartiality, if you want to put that word to it, has occurred. God knows how many fold in the last 20 years. So it would be out of date, to say the least. But But the fact it's suppressed doesn't surprise me at all. The BBC is a law unto itself, and it doesn't follow the rules that every other organisation, even those that it insists do follow the rules itself, as from a hypocritical point of view. It just ignores it. It believes it's too big, too important, and has got away with it for too long.
Well, personally, I'm a bit shocked and annoyed. If anything else, because the BBC as a public body, and Matthew perhaps can talk about it, they are subjected to all sorts of open and freedom of information openness. Kind of what they do should be scrutinizable by the public. But on the other hand, I'm not surprised in the least, because the BBC is stuffed of cosmopolitan, young, LGBTJKLM people, and they're all lefties. And what happens on the left? Well, we know that under Corbyn, up to 4 years ago, the party actually broke the legislation against discrimination by being anti-Semitic. And this particular report that the Labour Party did once the new leader was in place was only released clearly in order to get rid of the other side who are the faction against him. So it's not that the Labour Party was trying to be open and show, oh, look at us, there was some anti-Semitism and we rooted it out. It was just to look at us, we're rooting it out, at the same time get rid of the political current that goes against me. So I'm call me cynical, but I'm not surprised in the very least.
Matthew, what do you make of this?
Well, just really to explain for overseas viewers who may not be aware, just to be clear, in terms of the services the BBC run in this country, the main source of funding for that is a television license fee, which anybody who wants to own a television set in this country is required to pay, irrespective of whether you actually want to watch any of the BBC's channels. And it's actually a criminal offence not to to watch television without actually having paid that license fee, which I know people certainly in the United States tend to be absolutely astonished by. But given that is certainly at the moment the funding situation, surely the BBC ought to be answerable to the public, to the people who are paying for their services. And I would say yes, Daniel. I would. Sorry, everyone. Daniel put a text message up on the screen.
He's being awfully against British people, is what he's being.
But given what the funding situation is, the BBC should be answerable to us, to the viewers, to the people who are paying for it. And we certainly ought to have access to whatever is in this report, I would say.
Yeah. Just before we get to the final comments, I guess, as we're into the last 10 minutes, just for the super chats, Ashley Shrugged super chatted $1.99 and said poppycock is a magically British word from a Yank. So there you go. I think, was that you, Richard? He said poppycock, or was that Marco? It was Marco. Yeah, there you go. And then John was $3. Thank you, John. I think John's on tomorrow, so we'll see you soon. So what's interesting about this, Michael Balan is actually retired now. That's how long ago this report was commissioned. He's 66, and he ended his career as head of editorial standards at BBC. And he's been asked what he thinks about the fact that it's never been published. And he actually is in favor of it not being published, which is really quite remarkable to me, that he compiled this report just for 4 or 5 people to ever have a look at. And the BBC has said that they're not publishing it so that they can privately reflect on its own journalism or something bizarre like that. And so, I mean, for license fees, I mean, do you guys, so Mark and Richard, do you guys have a license fee, and are you going to continue paying it now, or?
Well, we haven't had a license fee for 6-7 years since Brexit, really, when the BBC didn't take a political position at all. So at that point we're so disgusted we stopped paying. But actually, you cannot pay if you don't watch live TV or you don't watch the catch-up services provided by the BBC. Everything else you can watch it. So I urge everyone who wants to give themselves 157 pounds cut on their tax burden to don't watch live TV. If you want to watch the latest match, go to the pub, have a pint, and watch your favorite team, and watch everything else on catch up. Just don't watch the BBC. It's crap anyway. So why would you want to do it?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And why not spend £57 in the pub?
Matthew, what about you?
Well, Marco, actually, you're quite right. I apologise. I misspoke slightly a minute ago.
Technically, it's the ownership of television, but television nowadays, you can have a monitor, a computer monitor, and that's not a television, so suck it.
Yeah, sure. Well, speaking for myself, I do have a license. I do watch the BBC, more so the kind of entertainment channels rather than not necessarily so much the news and current affairs stuff. But I do watch their TV, and I do have a license fee.
And obviously, it's a personal choice.
Sorry?
It's a personal choice for everybody as to what.
For people outside the UK, if the BBC or suspects you of watching live TV without paying a license fee, they'll send some rather charming men around to your house who will try and pressure you into letting them into your house so that they can see whether you've been watching live TV, and so on and so forth. Or they'll say, if you're a student, they'll send you threatening letters, whether they know whether you've watched live TV or not, saying, we know you've been watching it, you need to pay. So they're really quite charming. And whilst it's true that a TV license is a personal choice, if I don't have a TV license, if I did have one, we need to make an impact somehow, and I'd be cancelling my TV license as a result of this until they publish the report, because they can't. If there is any anti-Israeli or anti-Semitic bias at the BBC, I think we, as you said, Michael, we as a British public need to know about it. Just as the Labour Party had to do an internal investigation headed by Shami Chakrabarti into anti-Semitism, because we need to know if the potential government of this country has anti-Semites in it. We need to know if the state-funded, publicly funded broadcaster has this bias going on, and we need to do something about it. But we're coming to the end of the show. Do you guys, any final comments on this or anything we've spoken about today?
Well, I mean, the BBC is one of those things that it used to be a highly regarded, well-respected institution that reflected Britain, and it's one of the many institutions that's been destroyed and corroded by those within it and the attitudes of the people that support them, in the same way that even institutions like the police have been, sadly. When they're, kneeling for BLM or fist pumping a pro-Palestine guy who's just shouted from the river to the sea. It's just another example of the same thing. So it's depressing to see what things that were once really good and that you were proud, stood for your country, to be damaged in that way, because then, you've got to look elsewhere. And of course, the only way to look really is to your own life.
And on the other hand, the BBC is just another institution that represents what the culture is nowadays. It's just like until a year ago, they were taking a mickey, joking about a minister of state having a British flag behind him. They were literally laughing at somebody with a British flag behind them. And when they realized actually the public opinion was in favor of having a British flag, they changed the tune. So now it's acceptable even for the Labour Party to flag British flag Union Jacks.
Yeah, Matthew, any final comments?
No, just really to say that there does seem to, kind of picking up on what Marco and Richard were just saying, that there does seem to increasingly be this kind of disconnect almost between the culture at certainly the news and current affairs at the BBC and the sort of population at large. There's this very almost kind of metropolitan lefty liberal attitude that comes across in the news coverage, which isn't I think isn't necessarily shared by the rest of the country.
Yeah, that actually ties into our final super chat from Frank Grail for $2, who asks, "Are you fans of British sci-fi authors, and are they lefties?" I have a few things to say about that. What do you guys? Do you like sci-fi?
We're living sci-fi right now, so I'm not sure about that. Do you mean Doctor Who and this kind of stuff?
Because anything, I guess.
We used to watch it. We stopped that when it became the Scottish guy. Something.
I think it ended up crowbarring their politics into their entertainment. The same occurred with medical dramas and stuff like that, and that all of that culminated in why we gave up on the BBC and gave up on a license and watching live TV all at the same time, because they began to use their dramas to reinforce the agenda that they got on news channels, and that just became, there was no escape from being lectured as far as you could see. So yeah. Sci-fi is best when it isn't just a thin veil for telling you what to do once more.
And for the record, the Scottish guy, when we stopped there, it wasn't Tennant, it was Capaldi.
Sure. Matthew, do you like sci-fi?
I do enjoy. I watch a lot of sci-fi. It's probably one of my favorite sort of genres, if that's the right term. Doctor Who, sorry to all the viewers, our technician Daniel keeps sending amusing messages, which is why I keep grimacing. I've been a fan of Doctor Who since childhood, since it was this comparatively sort of low budget thing in the 1980s. I thought it was absolutely wonderful when they first brought it back probably about 20 years ago with it wasn't initially David Tennant. It was initially Christopher Eccleston and then David Tennant. I've continued to watch it. I get why some people feel it's getting a bit woke. Russell T Davies, who produced it when it first came back with Christopher Eccleston, is actually about to come back as the executive producer, so we'll see. Let's see what he does with it.
Yeah, I watched Doctor Who as a kid, and I really enjoyed it up until the end of Matt Smith's time at Doctor Who, and then I agree, Peter Capaldi. As much as I really like him at other stuff, I think the writing kind of declined around about that time, so I didn't enjoy it. And there is a kind of left-wing bias going on. Actually, Frank asked just in general, I guess, about science fiction authors, in British science fiction authors. So I will say I really love H.G. Wells. I don't know if you guys ever read Wells, but he's really interesting. Oh, we have a hard stop. Okay, we're going to have to go in a minute. But I'll just say H.G. Wells is magnificent. You should read him. But he's left-wing for his time, which means he's a virulent racist and eugenicist. So there's problems there. So guys, thanks for joining me. Daniel, do we have any announcements?
We have the Fountainhead Book Club we have a Fountainhead Book Club in about a minute. That's for ARCUK members only, but it's available to all members. The session will also be live streamed to our YouTube members, so I'm putting the link for that in the chat.
Fantastic. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me. And I'll be back tomorrow for the reality show, and we'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye.